Welcome to the Two Beans in a Pod. Listener, you've shared some really thought-provoking material with us today, and we're going to take a deep dive into the potential fallout from the Trump administration's proposed tariffs. We'll be examining the idea of significant tariff implementation, drawing primarily from Stephen Miran's paper, alongside some recent news analysis and that discussion featuring Dalio and Scott Bessent.
Right, quite a mix of perspectives there.
Exactly. Our mission, listener, is really to cut through the noise and understand what these sources suggest about the possible consequences, the strategic rationale and the hurdles such a policy shift might face.
And quickly, right. You want clarity and depth without getting bogged down.
Precisely. So let's get straight to it.
Okay, let's begin by unpacking Stephen Miran's paper from November 2024, A User's Guide to Restructuring the Global Trading System. Now, listener Miran, who is now the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, wrote this while he was the senior strategist at Hudson Bay Capital. And his paper outlines a a fundamental reshaping of international trade and finance, which he clearly views as a long-held objective of President Trump.
Yeah, and it seems Miran's core argument isn't just about, say, specific unfair trade practices. He believes there's a more fundamental issue at play, which is the persistent overvaluation of the U.S. dollar.
Yeah.
He contends that this overvaluation, driven by the world's seemingly endless demand for dollar-denominated reserve assets, puts American manufacturers at a significant disadvantage globally.
Exactly. He frames this within the context of the Triffin Dilemma, listener. Think of it like this. The world needs dollars, right? As a medium of exchange, a safe store of value.
The global marketplace currency.
Precisely. But the country supplying that currency, the U.S. in this case, can end up running persistent trade deficits because everyone wants to hold on to those dollars. Miran argues that the U.S. providing this reserve asset status, plus what he calls a defense umbrella, has become increasingly burdensome.
And the cost falls disproportionately
on American manufacturing and other trade-oriented sectors. They bear the economic cost, according to him.
It does seem a bit paradoxical, doesn't it? You'd think having the world's reserve currency would just be a clear advantage.
You would think. But Miran points out this status can artificially inflate the dollar's value, makes our exports more expensive, makes imports relatively cheaper here.
Which feeds right back into those trade deficits that have been such a political flashpoint for years.
Exactly. And that's a key driver, he argues. Now, Miran also looks back at the tariffs imposed on China in 2018 and 2019. What's quite interesting here is his assertion that those tariffs didn't have a massive impact on the overall U.S. economy. He argues this was partly because the dollar actually strengthened during that period.
Oh, interesting.
Effectively counteracting much of the tariffs' price effect. And he also notes the Chinese currency weakened, meaning to some extent China absorbed a significant portion of the tariff cost. They effectively paid it, in his view.
So when we consider the potential for even higher tariffs this time, you mentioned, Miran suggests figures like 60% on China, 10% or higher globally. This idea of a currency offset becomes really central.
Absolutely central.
Could you maybe unpack how that's supposed to work, listener?
Certainly. The basic idea is, well, if the currency of the country exporting goods to the U.S. weakens by roughly the same percentage as the tariff being imposed, then the price of those imported goods in U.S. dollars doesn't change dramatically. For example, a 10% tariff is put on, but the exporter's currency drops about 9% against the dollar.
So the net price increase is minimal.
Potentially minimal, yeah. In theory, listener, this could mean American consumers wouldn't see a significant price hike from the tariffs themselves.
Okay, but here's where it gets a bit tricky, isn't it? Because Miran does acknowledge those well-regarded academic studies.
Yeah.
Cavallo, Fagelbaum, Amidi.
Right, the microdata studies.
Yeah, looking at actual prices of specific imports. And they found the dollar price of imports from China went up by almost the full tariff amount.
With very little pass-through of the dollar's strength to lower consumer prices. That's generally what those studies concluded, listener.
So how does Miran counter that?
Well, he offers a couple of important counterpoints. First, he suggests that initially, American importers might have just squeezed their profit margins, absorbed the cost temporarily to avoid hiking prices right away.
Okay, plausible, maybe short-term.
And more significantly, he highlights the issue of re-export diversion. Essentially, listener, instead of sending goods directly to the U.S. and paying the tariff, Chinese companies might have shipped them to, say, Vietnam or Mexico.
Right.
done some minimal processing there, maybe just relabeling, and then shipped them to the U.S. marked as originating from that country to dodge the specific China tariffs.
So the trade data might not capture the full picture if goods are being rerouted.
Exactly. Research suggests this kind of rerouting definitely increased during the last round. So Miran concludes that if currency markets adjust as he anticipates, the inflationary impact of these new, potentially much higher tariffs could be relatively contained, maybe 0% to 0.6% on overall consumer prices.
0. That seems ambitious.
Well, potentially zero net impact on inflation from the tariffs, especially when combined with other potential Trump policies. He argues things like tax cuts, deregulation, boosting domestic energy production, those could actually be disinflationary overall.
So a mix of effects. Upward pressure from tariffs,
Yeah.
possibly offset by downward pressure elsewhere.
That's the argument, like pressing down on prices in some areas while tariffs push up in others.
Now, the crucial question then, listener, is who actually pays for these tariffs? It's not always obvious.
No, it's not. Miran breaks it down based on whether that currency offset actually happens. Scenario 1. Perfect currency offset occurs. In that case, the exporting nation's purchasing power drops their currency is worth less, and the U.S. Treasury collects the tariff revenue. American consumers. Not much change in prices.
Okay, that's the ideal scenario from his perspective. What if the offset doesn't happen?
Then, scenario 2. American consumers likely end up paying higher prices for those imported goods. Over time, this could push U.S. businesses to find suppliers in countries not hit by the high tariffs.
Shifting supply chains.
Exactly. Which could eventually mean less tariff revenue being collected, too.
He also talks about how they might be implemented, not just flipping a switch overnight.
No, definitely not. Miran advocates for a gradual implementation. He points out even in 2018-19, the tariff hikes were phased in. A pre-announced schedule of increases, he suggests, could minimize market disruption, give businesses time to adjust.
And keep the pressure on countries like China.
Right, sustain pressure to change trade practices.
And it wouldn't be a flat tariff on everyone. He suggests differentiating.
Precisely. He proposes different tariff levels based on several factors. A country's currency policies, their existing trade deals with the U.S., security agreements, even shared values.
So like a tiered system.
Exactly. The idea, listener, is that access to the big U.S. market becomes a privilege that must be earned. Cooperate, play fair, get lower tariffs. Don't, and you face higher ones.
Which really brings home his point about trade and national security being linked.
Absolutely intertwined in his view. Tariffs become a tool not just for economics, but also for better security outcomes, encouraging allies to share more of the defense burden. If you benefit from the U.S. security umbrella, maybe you should contribute more, and trade terms can be leverage.
He also mentions fiscal devaluations. Sounds a bit technical. Can you break that down, listener?
Sure. It's basically the idea that you can achieve a similar effect to devaluing your currency through fiscal policy changes. For example, combining import tariffs with export subsidies, or maybe raising consumption taxes while cutting payroll taxes.
So other ways to boost competitiveness besides just changing the exchange rate directly.
Exactly. It's another tool in the theoretical toolbox influencing the trade balance.
And Miran also argues, interestingly, that tariffs might be less harmful to the U.S. economy than, say, raising income taxes.
That's his perspective, yeah. He argues that because U.S. marginal tax rates on labor and capital are already quite high, adding tariffs might create fewer economic distortions compared to hiking income or corporate taxes further. It's a relative argument.
Of course, the big elephant in the room is retaliation, right?
Yeah.
What if other countries just slap tariffs back on U.S. goods?
He addresses that. He mentions the optimal tariff theory a large country like the U.S. might initially gain by pushing down import prices with a small tariff. But he quickly adds the crucial caveat. If other countries retaliate, those gains evaporate.
The preventing retaliation is key.
Absolutely critical. But Miran seems to believe the U.S. is better positioned to withstand a trade fight, especially with China. He points to the large U.S. consumer market, our deep capital markets, versus China's capital controls and reliance on exports to the U.S.
This leads to some of his more ambitious ideas, like the Mar-a-Lago Accord. What's that about?
Yeah, that's his vision for a potential future multilateral currency deal. The core idea: The U.S. might reduce tariffs if trading partners agree to adjust their currency values against the dollar.
A grand bargain almost.
Potentially. He even suggests linking it to partners taking on more global security costs and maybe restructuring their U.S. debt holdings into longer-term bonds. It's a very broad renegotiation concept.
Wow. And he doesn't rule out the U.S. acting alone on currency either.
No, he explores using IEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. This could mean things like limiting money transfers to adversaries or currency manipulators, or even potentially different tax treatment for holdings of U.S. dollar reserves based on the country holding them.
And what about the Fed? Does he expect them to play ball?
He seems to anticipate some level of cooperation. He points to the Fed's mandate, maximum employment, stable prices. He argues big currency swings could threaten those goals, giving the Fed a reason to intervene if necessary. He even mentions historical precedents of Treasury-Fed coordination.
Okay, so summing up Miran's view for you, listener. Tariffs are the likely primary tool implemented gradually. The goal is rebalancing the global economy, sharing security costs. Currency adjustments are vital to making it work without huge inflation. And he sees potential for big international deals or unilateral moves, possibly with Fed involvement.
That's a good summary, a very detailed, strategic, perhaps optimistic view of how tariffs could be used. Now, let's shift gears, because Ray Dalio in that Fox Business segment paints a very, very different picture, much more concerning.
Yes, starkly different. He draws these parallels to the 1930s. Tariffs, massive debt, a rising power challenging the existing one.
Unsettling parallels, he calls them, suggesting these factors could lead to really disruptive shifts in global systems. Very serious warnings.
And his big worry seems to be the U.S. budget deficit. He flags projections showing it surging if policies don't change.
Absolutely. He warns that if the U.S. doesn't get its fiscal house in order, we could face a serious supply-demand problem for government debt. Not enough buyers for all the bonds being issued. And the outcome, he says, could be worse than a normal recession.
And on tariffs themselves, Dalio's take seems much simpler than Miran's complex mechanisms.
Very straightforward. He basically says tariffs are taxes on imports. The importer pays initially, but very often that cost gets passed right along to consumers through higher prices. Full stop.
No complex currency offset discussion there.
Not really. His focus is more on the direct cost impact. And his worst-case scenario, listener, is genuinely alarming. A potential decline in the value of money, rising internal conflict, social, political, and international conflict disrupting the world economy. Even mentions the possibility of military conflict.
So a much darker potential future painted by Dalio, contrasting sharply with Miran's more strategic managed approach.
Definitely. Now let's bring in the current U.S. Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, from that Tucker Carlson interview. He's obviously a staunch defender of the Trump tariff plan.
Oh, absolutely. He really emphasizes that Trump's been talking tariffs for decades, framing this new regime as transformational for the U.S. economy and especially the American worker.
He even compares it to Reagan's early presidency, suggesting maybe some initial choppiness, but ultimately leading to big positive change.
And his core argument is that American workers were eviscerated, his word, by unfair trade, particularly the China shock. These tariffs, he claims, are about bringing back the old standard of living, giving working folks real wage gains.
Right. He also pushes back against the idea that tariffs are automatically bad, noting that many U.S. trading partners, even allies, have their own tariffs. He kind of asks, why would they worry if only U.S. consumers pay?
His stated goal is reindustrializing the U.S., especially in critical sectors, medicines, chips, ships.
Their national security industries, yeah.
Yeah.
He points to COVID as a beta test, as he put it, highlighting how fragile those global supply chains were.
And he had that very punchy motto.
Wall Street's done great, it can continue doing well, but it's Main Street's turn. Really frames who he sees as the intended beneficiaries.
What about the stock market jitters? That always comes up with tariffs.
He tries to brush those off, suggests recent market dips are more about tech stock adjustments. The Mag 7 problem. He called it not a reaction to Trump's policies, which he dubbed the magnet problem, implying they'll attract investment. A bit of wordplay there.
He also seemed pretty dismissive of CBO projections.
Yeah, he basically argues their models don't capture the positive growth effects from tax cuts or the revenue generated by tariffs, both the old ones and the proposed new ones. He seems confident that tariff revenue will be significant.
But can the U.S. actually make all this stuff again? Do we have the workers? Bessent seemed optimistic.
He did. He pointed to AI, automation, smart factories, thinks technology means the existing workforce can handle a manufacturing resurgence.
And he outlined a broader strategy beyond just tariffs.
Right. That's right. It's a three-pronged approach, as he described it. Reordering trade via tariffs, shrinking the federal government's footprint, less labor, less borrowing, and unleashing the private sector through deregulation.
He admits he can't guarantee no recession, but
he doesn't see why one should happen. Draws that parallel again to Reagan's belief in supply-side economics. He used an analogy reinforcing cockpit doors before a crash, suggesting they're taking necessary steps now to prevent a future financial mess.
he also expects a lot of lobbying from other countries once this tiered tariff system starts shaping up.
Oh yeah, expects foreign governments will be lining up trying to get better terms, given the plan to differentiate based on behavior, alliances, etc.
And if trade disputes do flare up, Bessent thinks the U.S. has the upper hand.
He argues surplus countries like China are inherently in a weaker negotiating position than debtor countries like the U.S. He called China's model the most imbalanced in the history of the modern world and claimed Trump's earlier tariffs already broke their business model. Strong words.
And he's pretty confident this will all work out relatively quickly.
Predict success within 4 years, yeah. Cites perceived positive results for workers during Trump's first term from the China tariffs as evidence.
He used that striking comparison from summer 2024, record European vacations alongside record food bank use in the U.S.
Yeah, using that to illustrate the economic divide he believes the tariffs will help fix. His message is that the bottom 50% aren't losers, they're just caught in a bad system that needs fixing with good jobs.
And finally, on the dollar, he was very emphatic.
Very clear. Only Trump and himself speak for the administration on dollar policy, and the long-run policy is a strong dollar, regardless of any short-term wiggles.
Okay, listeners, so Bessent offers this forceful defense.
Yeah.
Tariffs are transformational, pro-worker, vital for national security, and part of a broader strategy for growth, all while maintaining a long-term, strong dollar policy. A very different take again.
Now, we also need to touch on that geopolitical economy report article you shared, which looked critically at a speech Miran gave back in April.
All right, this offers yet another interpretation, and it's quite critical.
Definitely. The article interprets Miran's strategy, especially the Mar-a-Lago Accord idea, as essentially forcing countries to pay tribute to the U.S. to maintain its global financial and military dominance.
Using tariffs as the stick, basically.
Exactly. It highlights Miran's comments about the cost of providing the security umbrella and the dollar reserve status, framing the call for burden sharing as demanding concessions. They mention alleged threats of huge tariffs, like 100% on BRICS nations or those trying to de-dollarize.
And it quotes Miran saying dollar dominance is a great thing, with the goal being to manage its downside so it can continue in perpetuity.
Right, which the article implicitly links back to that Triffin Dilemma, the inherent contradiction of being the reserve currency issuer.
Wow.
They also note China's response condemning unilateral bullying and saying they'd fight to the end.
The report also pushes back on Miran's assertion that the U.S. would easily win a trade war.
Yes, it cites economist Jeffrey Sachs arguing U.S. deficits stem from overspending and low productivity, not just other countries being unfair. And it questions the feasibility of large-scale reindustrialization, using Apple's struggles shifting iPhone production as an example of deep-rooted skills in places like China.
So questioning the core economic logic and practicality.
Pretty strongly. It even uses phrases like protection racket and rogue mafia state to describe the tariff strategy, and it references Michael Hudson's concept of super-imperialism, the idea that the U.S. deficit functions as a form of tribute, with dollars flowing back into treasuries and Wall Street.
Wow, okay, so a drastically different, highly critical lens, viewing this as imperial coercion rather than economic rebalancing.
A stark contrast indeed. It really highlights the massive divergence in how these potential policies are being framed and interpreted.
So, listener, as you can clearly see, we have a real range of views here. Miran, now in that key policy role, presents tariffs as this strategic tool, rebalance the global economy, bring back manufacturing, share the costs of U.S. leadership. He's banking on currency adjustments, mitigating the downsides.
Then you have Dalio, voicing these deep systemic concerns, echoes of the 1930s, fears of financial breakdown driven by tariffs, debt, and geopolitics, a much more cautionary, even alarming perspective.
Then Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, vigorously defends the plan. It's about the American worker, national security, reshoring critical industries. He's confident it leads to a stronger U.S. economy, avoids calamity, helps Main Street.
And finally, that geopolitical economy report offers that sharply critical interpretation, viewing the tariffs not as rebalancing, but as an imperial strategy to extract tribute, questioning the whole economic logic and feasibility.
It's a really complex issue, listener, with significant potential consequences, no matter which perspective you lean towards. If you're finding this deep dive valuable, please do hit that like button and subscribe for more in-depth analysis from us here at Two Beans in a Pod.
Yeah, we'd appreciate that.
So, considering these different viewpoints, listener, what stands out to you as the most critical factor here? What's going to ultimately determine if this Trump tariff policy succeeds or fails? Is it how global markets react?
Or maybe the specific response from trading partners like China, how they push back or perhaps accommodate.
Or is it that technical point, the degree of currency offset? Does that actually materialize the way Miran hopes?
Or maybe it's the underlying assumptions themselves about how the U.S. economy works, how the global economy functions. Are those assumptions fundamentally sound or flawed? Lots to think about.
Thank you for listening to Two Beans in a Pod.